January 11th, 1944. High above the snow-dusted canopy of the Ostersleben forests, the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109G-6 is a cramped, oil-scented sanctuary for Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt. At 29,000 feet, the world is a silent expanse of cobalt blue and blinding white light. Below him, the combat boxes of American B-17 flying fortresses crawl across the landscape like silver beetles, their contrails stitching a white shroud across the German Reich. To Schmidt, they look vulnerable. For months, the American little friends, the Thunderbolts and Lightnings, have been forced to turn back at the German border, their fuel needles dipping into the red. Schmidt checks his 6. Clear. He begins his dive, a predator closing in on a wounded giant. But as he glances toward the sun, the glare shifts. 6 glinting shapes, sleeker and faster than anything he has encountered before, are screaming down from the stratosphere. They aren't turning back. They aren't low on fuel. For the first time, the hunters have become the hunted. A burst of .50 caliber fire tears through Schmidt's port wing, and the illusion of a protected German sky shatters instantly. The era of the interceptor is over. The era of the Mustang has begun. By late 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign over Europe was teetering on the edge of a catastrophic failure. The visionary doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces, that heavily armed combat boxes of bombers could defend themselves through mass firepower, was being methodically dismantled by the Luftwaffe. To the planners in Washington and at High Wycombe, the logic had seemed sound. A B-17 flying fortress, bristling with 13.50 caliber machine guns, should be an airborne fortress capable of crossing the Rhine, delivering its payload, and returning home without the need for fighter escort. This was not merely a tactical preference. It was a necessity born of technical limitations. No Allied fighter in 1942 or early 1943 possessed the range to accompany the bombers deep into the industrial heart of Germany. The reality in the freezing skies over Europe was far grimmer than the theorists had anticipated. The German Jagdwaffe fighter force had evolved with terrifying efficiency. They were no longer just dogfighters. They had become specialists in aerial demolition. Recognizing that the American bombers were vulnerable to head-on attacks, German pilots like the veterans of Jägerschwader 1 and 26 developed high-speed frontal passes that exploited the B-17's limited defensive fire from the nose. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe had also begun equipping their Bf-109s and Fw-190s with Werfer Granit 21 rockets. Massive, unguided projectiles that could be fired from outside the range of the American machine guns, scattering the tight bomber formations like bowling pins. The breaking point arrived in October 1943, during what would forever be remembered by air crews as Black Week. The target was the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the aircraft factories at Regensburg. These were the vital organs of the Nazi war machine, and the USAF was determined to excise them. However, as the P-47 Thunderbolts reached the limit of their range and were forced to peel away near the German border, the Luftwaffe pounced. Without little friends to protect them, the bombers were subjected to hours of relentless, coordinated assaults. On October 14, 1943, 2nd Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s into the fray. 60 were shot down, and another 138 were damaged, many so severely they would never fly again. It was a 20% loss rate in a single afternoon. Mathematically, no Air Force could survive such attrition. The crews who did return were haunted, landing at bases in East Anglia to find empty barracks and ghost-filled mess halls. General Henry Hap, Arnold and his commanders were forced to face a devastating truth. The unescorted bomber was a dead concept. The strategic bombing mission, intended to be the hammer that would break the Third Reich, was instead being shattered against the anvil of German airspace. The Americans had the industrial capacity to build thousands of planes, but they were losing their most experienced crews faster than they could be replaced. If a solution to the range problem was not found, the invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, would have to be postponed indefinitely, as no landing could occur under a sky controlled by the Luftwaffe. The search for a long-range savior became a race against time, centered on a neglected airframe that many had originally dismissed as a mere support craft. The solution to the Allied crisis did not come from a new design, but from a desperate marriage of two existing technologies. The North American P-51 Mustang had been born in 1940, originally designed for the British Royal Air Force. While the airframe was revolutionary, featuring a laminar flow wing that reduced drag and an innovative radiator scoop that actually generated a small amount of jet-like thrust, it was hampered by its initial power plant. The Allison V1710 engine lacked a two-stage supercharger, meaning that above 15,000 feet, the Mustang lost its breath. It was relegated to low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack, a thoroughbred force to pull a plow. The turning point came not in a boardroom, but in the cockpit of a British test pilot, Ronald Harker. After flying the Mustang, he remarked that the airframe was far superior to the engine inside it. He suggested a radical experiment, transplanting the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the heart of the Spitfire, into the Mustang's fuselage. The result was the P-51B. When the Merlin's two-stage supercharger engaged at high altitudes, the Mustang transformed. It was no longer just a scout. It was a high-altitude interceptor capable of speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour. However, speed and altitude were only half of the requirement. To save the daylight offensive, the Mustang needed to fly from the bases in England, orbit over targets like Berlin or Leipzig for 30 minutes of high-intensity combat, and then fly all the way back. The P-51 already had impressive internal fuel capacity, but it wasn't enough to reach the Big B, Berlin. In a feat of wartime engineering, designers squeezed an additional 85-gallon self-sealing fuel tank directly behind the pilot's seat. This modification shifted the aircraft's center of gravity, making it notoriously unstable when full, but it provided the one thing the 8th Air Force needed more than anything else: range. By late 1943, the first P-51BS began arriving in England, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The pilots, many of whom had been flying the bulky P-47 Thunderbolt, were initially wary of the Mustang's delicate-looking liquid-cooled engine, which could be brought down by a single bullet to the radiator. But as they took the P-51 into the thin air of the stratosphere, they realized they held a weapon that could finally take the fight to the heart of the Reich. The stage was set for a fundamental shift in the air war. The Americans finally had a fighter that didn't have to turn back, and the Luftwaffe was about to receive the shock of its life as these sleek silhouettes began appearing where no Allied fighter was ever supposed to be. To understand the impact of the P-51, one must look at the tactical angle of the Zemke fan. Before the Mustang's arrival, escort fighters were tethered to the bombers in close escort formations. They were forbidden from leaving the B-17s, forced to fly in weaving patterns to stay at the bombers' slow cruising speeds. This handed the initiative to the Luftwaffe, who could choose when and where to strike. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, taking command of the 8th Air Force in early 1944, famously changed this. He saw the Mustang's potential and issued a blunt order. The duty of fighters is to seek out and destroy the enemy. The bombers will provide the bait. This birthed the ultimate pursuit tactic. Mustangs were released from their defensive tethers to roam miles ahead of the bomber stream, hunting German interceptors as they were still forming up or refueling. The German pilots, expecting to engage sluggish bombers, were instead intercepted by Mustangs diving from the sun's side, catching them with their flaps down and their gear up. From a technological angle, the P-51 was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency. The most critical component was the laminar flow wing. In traditional aircraft, air becomes turbulent as it moves across the wing, creating skin friction drag. The P-51's wing moved the thickest part of the airfoil further back, maintaining a smooth, laminar flow of air over a larger surface area. This reduced drag so significantly that the Mustang could achieve higher speeds with less fuel consumption than its contemporaries. Combined with the Meredith effect, where the radiator cooling system was designed so that the heated air exiting the duct actually provided a small amount of forward thrust. The Mustang became the most efficient long-range piston engine fighter of the war. It wasn't just a plane. It was a specialized tool designed to solve a specific mathematical problem of the European theater: how to carry enough fuel to fly 1,500 miles while retaining the agility to kill a Bf-109. This technical edge meant that for the first time, an American pilot didn't just have a seat at the table. He owned the room. From the enemy angle, the appearance of the P-51 over the German heartland was a psychological blow that resonated from the frontline airfields to the highest levels of the Nazi high command. For years, the Luftwaffe had operated under the assumption that the air war had two distinct zones: the front, where fighters clashed, and the Reich, where slow bombers were intercepted by specialized heavy gun destroyers. The P-51 dissolved this distinction. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring famously remarked after the war that when he saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. To a German pilot in a heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190 Sturmbach, the Mustang was a nightmare. The German planes had been up-armored and up-gunned with 30mm cannons to shred B-17s, making them heavy and sluggish. When they encountered the nimble Mustangs, they found themselves in a mismatched fight, trying to dogfight a lightweight thoroughbred while carrying the weight of a tank. The stunned reaction of the German pilots wasn't just surprise. It was the realization that there was no longer any safe altitude or distance. Even while landing at their own bases in the center of Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were being bounced by Mustangs that had followed them home from the stratosphere. This brings us to the human angle, the staggering physical toll on the American pilots. While the Mustang was a Cadillac of the skies, flying it was an exercise in extreme endurance. Missions often lasted 6 to 8 hours. The pilots sat in a cockpit barely large enough to move their limbs, strapped into a parachute and a life raft, wearing layers of heavy sheepskin and electrically heated suits that often failed. At 30,000 feet, the temperature outside the plexiglass dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Oxygen masks were prone to freezing, and bends, nitrogen bubbles in the blood, were a constant threat during rapid climbs. The psychological strain of navigating over a featureless carpet of clouds for 4 hours, only to engage in a terrifying, high-G dogfight with a life-or-death margin was measured in seconds, and then navigating 4 hours back over hostile territory, was immense. The Mustang didn't just require a pilot. It required an athlete with the mental fortitude to remain sharp after hours of sensory deprivation and bone-chilling cold. These men were the spearhead of a new kind of warfare, where the machine's range was limited only by the human's ability to endure. The tension that had been building throughout the winter of 1943 finally erupted in February in 1944. The Allies launched Operation Argument, known colloquially to the crews as Big Week. This was not just another series of raids. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort to bait the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition that would break the back of German air power before the planned invasion of Normandy. The target was the German aircraft industry itself, factories at Leipzig, Brunswick, and Gotha. For the first time, the P-51 Mustangs were deployed in massive, concentrated numbers. No longer content with mere survival, the 8th Air Force sent over 1,000 bombers and hundreds of fighters deep into the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in a desperate attempt to protect their production lines, but they found a sky that had fundamentally changed. The Mustangs were everywhere. They didn't wait for the German twin-engine destroyer planes to approach the bombers. They hunted them down while they were still assembling. Between February 20th and 25th, the air over Central Europe became a chaotic graveyard of aluminum and silk. On February 24th alone, over 1,000 heavy bombers struck Schweinfurt in Gotha, escorted by a massive screen of P-51s and P-47s. The German pilots, who had previously been able to loiter near the bomber streams, were now forced to fight for their lives from the moment they cleared the runway. The Mustang's ability to dive from the sun with superior speed meant that German flight leaders were being shot down before they could even issue a command. The scale of the carnage was unprecedented. During those 6 days of Big Week, the USAF lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters. It was a heavy price, but for the Luftwaffe, the cost was terminal. They lost 262 fighters and, more importantly, nearly 100 of their most experienced pilots. The Big Week proved that with the Mustang in the lead, the Americans could now strike anywhere in the Reich with impunity. The invisible wall the Luftwaffe had built around Germany had been kicked in, and the P-51 was the boot that did it. If Big Week was the initial breach, the weeks that followed in March 1944 were the systematic demolition of the German Air Force. The focus shifted to the most prestigious and dangerous target of all, Berlin. On March 6, 1944, the USAF launched its first full-scale daylight raid on the German capital. Over 700 bombers were escorted by nearly 800 fighters, including a massive contingent of P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at the formation, resulting in the largest single-day air battle of the war. The P-51 was no longer just a protector. It had become an apex predator. American pilots, led by legends like Chuck Yeager and Bud Anderson, utilized the Mustang's superior high-altitude performance to execute high-side passes on German formations. The German pilots, flying the Bf-109 and Fw-190, found that even their best evasive maneuvers, a split S or a high-speed dive, could be easily followed by the Mustang. The P-51's maneuverability at 30,000 feet allowed it to stay on the tail of German fighters through violent, high-G turns that would have caused other Allied planes to stall. The true turning point, however, was not just the loss of aircraft, but the loss of human capital. The Luftwaffe could build more planes, but they could not replace the the veteran pilots who had been flying since the Spanish Civil War or the invasion of Poland. During the frantic battles of March and April 1944, the P-51s specifically targeted the leaders of German formations. When a German squadron leader was shot down, the remaining pilots, often teenagers with less than 50 hours of flight time, became disorganized and easy prey. By the end of this period, the Luftwaffe was forced into a strategy of selective interception. They could no longer afford to challenge every raid. The sky over Germany, once the most defended airspace in the world, had become an American lake. The Mustangs were now ranging hundreds of miles ahead of the bombers, strafing German airfields and catching the Luftwaffe on the ground. The stunned silence on the German radio frequencies was the sound of a superpower losing its wings. The Mustang had not just won a battle. It had achieved the one thing necessary for the liberation of Europe: total air supremacy. With the Luftwaffe's back broken by the spring of 1944, the P-51 Mustang enabled a shift in strategy that would ultimately paralyze the German war machine. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the Strategic Air Forces in Europe, recognized that the Allied air forces now possessed a window of absolute freedom. They used this freedom to launch the oil campaign. Starting in May 1944, the target list shifted from aircraft factories to the synthetic oil plants at Luna, Politz, and Brux. These facilities were the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. Without fuel, the Panzers could not move, and the remaining Luftwaffe jets could not take off. Because the P-51 could loiter for extended periods deep within German territory, the USAF was able to maintain a constant, suffocating presence over these refineries. Even when the German flak, anti-aircraft artillery, took its toll, the Mustangs were there to ensure that any German interceptors attempting to defend the refineries were intercepted long before they reached the bomber streams. The destruction of the oil industry had a cascading effect on the training of new German pilots. By mid-1944, the fuel shortage was so acute that the Luftwaffe was forced to drastically cut flight hours for its trainees. New recruits were being sent into combat with barely 20 hours of flight time, a death sentence when facing American pilots and Mustangs who had hundreds of hours of rigorous training. The disparity in skill became a chasm. By the time of the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, the absence of the Luftwaffe was the ultimate proof of the Mustang's success. General Dwight D. Eisenhower famously told his troops, If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours. On that historic day, out of the thousands of sorties flown, the Luftwaffe managed only a handful of desperate, ineffective passes over the beaches. The P-51 had cleared the way for the liberation of a continent, ensuring that the greatest amphibious invasion in history would not be bombed into the sea. The dominance of the P-51 Mustang in the final year of the war didn't just win battles. It accelerated the end of the piston engine era. As the Mustangs cleared the skies of conventional German aircraft, they inadvertently forced the Nazi leadership into a desperate gamble on Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. The most significant of these was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. In theory, the Me-262 was the Mustang superior, capable of speeds that made the P-51 look stationary. However, the Mustang's sheer numbers and its ability to loiter over German air bases created a tactical countermeasure that the jets could not overcome. American pilots developed rat-catching tactics, specifically hunting the Me-262s during their most vulnerable phases, takeoff and landing. Because the Mustang could stay deep in German territory for hours, they would orbit known jet bases like Lechfeld. When the fuel-hungry German jets slowed down to extend their landing gear, the P-51s would dive out of the sun, utilizing their kinetic energy to close the gap before the jets could accelerate. This tactical flexibility ensured that even the most advanced technology of the Third Reich was neutralized by the range and persistence of the Mustang. By the time of the German surrender in May 1945, the P-51 had compiled a staggering combat record. It was credited with the destruction of 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other Allied fighter in Europe. The loss ratio was equally lopsided. For every Mustang lost in aerial combat, it claimed nearly 11 enemy planes. But the numbers only tell half the story. The true aftermath was the complete erasure of the Luftwaffe as a coherent fighting force. The German air arm didn't just lose a war. It ceased to exist, its planes burned on the ground, and its pilots buried in the soil of the country they could no longer protect. The Mustang's success also redefined American air power for the coming decade. The lessons learned about long-range escort and the importance of aerodynamic efficiency paved the way for the jet-powered long-range fighters of the Cold War. The P-51 would see a second life in the Korean War, proving its ruggedness as a ground attack platform before finally being retired as the sun set on the age of the propeller. It had entered the war as an experimental hybrid and left it as the definitive symbol of Allied industrial and tactical might, a machine that had literally outrun the wind to save the strategic bombing mission. The North American P-51 Mustang remains more than just a relic of mid-century engineering. It stands as a testament to the moment when the tide of history was physically pushed back by the roar of a Merlin engine. In the quiet, thin air of the upper atmosphere, the Mustang did what no other machine could. It bridged the gap between a failing strategy and a total victory. It was the silver lining in a dark sky that had, for years, belonged to the hunters of the Luftwaffe. When we look back at the footage of Mustangs banking over the Rhine or parked on the grass strips of East Anglia, we aren't just looking at a fighter plane. We are looking at the culmination of an era. The Mustang was the final, perfect expression of the piston engine fighter, a machine born of a desperate marriage of British power and American design, refined in the crucible of the most violent air battles the world has ever seen. It changed the geography of the war, proving that no city was too distant and no target was safe from the reach of the little friends. Ultimately, the story of the P-51 is a human story. It is the story of the mechanic who squeezed a fuel tank behind pilot's seat, the engineer who smoothed a wing to the width of a hair, and the 20-year-old pilot who sat in a freezing cockpit for 8 hours, staring into the sun, waiting for the flicker of an enemy wing. The German pilots who were stunned on that January morning in 1944 weren't just surprised by a new plane. They were witnessing the arrival of an industrial and personal resolve that could not be beaten. As the echoes of the Merlin engine faded into the jet age, the Mustang left behind a world liberated from the shadow of the Reich. It remains a symbol of the high price of air supremacy and the incredible ingenuity required to reclaim the skies. The sun that once hid the diving Mustangs now sets on their legacy, one of the most decisive and elegant instruments of freedom ever to take flight.